Good morning. Here begins something new. I'm Charles Kuralt, and this is Sunday Morning, a 90-minute CBS News program that starts right now.
Charles Kuralt was America's most trusted storyteller. For decades, his warm baritone voice on CBS Sunday Morning and his iconic on-the-road segments brought comfort and honest reflection into millions of living rooms. He was the journalist who celebrated ordinary people, the bricklayers, maple syrup makers, and small-town dreamers overlooked by national media. His public persona radiated integrity, humility, and an unwavering commitment to truth. But beneath that carefully cultivated image lived a devastating secret. For 29 years, Kuralt financially supported another woman, Patricia Shannon, and her 3 children, essentially maintaining a second household while his wife of nearly 5 decades remained completely unaware. He paid college tuitions, made nightly phone calls, spent holidays as a surrogate father, and signed letters pop. The double life only unraveled after his death in July 1997, when a single handwritten letter surfaced from his hospital bed. Written just 16 days before he died, that note promised Shannon inheritance of his Montana property, a promise that would ignite one of the most scandalous estate battles in journalism history. The man who built a career on authenticity had lived a lie so elaborate, so meticulously compartmentalized, that even his own daughters never suspected until they sat at his funeral and watched a stranger walk through the door carrying proof of their father's betrayal. Charles Bishop Kuralt was born on September 10, 1934, in Wilmington, North Carolina, into a world far removed from the glamour that would later define his career. Much of his childhood unfolded on his grandparents' farm in Onslow County, where life was stripped to its essentials. There was no electricity to brighten the evenings, no indoor plumbing to soften the routines of daily survival. Water came from a hand pump in the yard, warmth from wood stoves that needed constant feeding, and entertainment from imagination alone. Young Charles thrived in that simplicity. He flew kites constructed from newspaper and string, carved slingshots from fallen branches, and invented elaborate games during long wagon rides with his grandmother to deliver tobacco to market. For hours, he'd pretend to be a guard protecting precious cargo from imaginary bandits. These childhood flights of fancy revealed an early capacity for storytelling and a gift for finding magic in the mundane, qualities that would later define his journalism. His father's work as a social worker exposed Charles to North Carolina's harsh realities. He witnessed segregation's daily cruelties in Charlotte and saw poverty's devastating grip on rural communities. These experiences planted seeds of empathy that would bloom throughout his career. Unlike journalists who parachuted into communities to extract stories, Kuralt understood hardship as lived experience, not abstract concept. In school, his talents crystallized early. He excelled at writing and discovered an affinity for radio, hosting shows and winning statewide contests. At just 14, he met President Harry Truman after winning a Voice of Democracy competition, an accolade that revealed both exceptional talent and the ambition driving it. By the time he graduated high school, Charles Kuralt had already begun constructing the persona that would captivate America: the thoughtful observer, the compassionate listener, the gentle truth teller. At the University of North Carolina, Kuralt's journalism found its political edge. As editor of the Daily Tar Heel, he wrote fearless editorials against segregation at a time when such positions invited serious backlash in the Jim Crow South. His columns challenged the status quo with eloquence and moral clarity, cementing his reputation as someone unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. This courage caught the attention of CBS News executives scouting for fresh talent. CBS hired him at just 23 years old, making Kuralt their youngest correspondent. By the late 1950s, he was covering Latin America's tumultuous political landscape. Revolutions in Cuba, coups in various capitals, riots erupting across the hemisphere. The work thrust him into genuine danger while simultaneously showcasing his signature composure under pressure. Even amid chaos, Kuralt maintained the calm, measured delivery that would become his trademark. His assignments grew more harrowing through the 1960s. He reported from Vietnam, where he witnessed combat's brutal realities firsthand and covered the civil rights movement in Selma, documenting both police violence and the remarkable courage of peaceful protesters. Unlike many correspondents who focused solely on dramatic confrontation, Kuralt conducted interviews that revealed deeper human truths, the fears, hopes, and moral calculations of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. But by 1967, the relentless chase of tragedy and conflict had exhausted him. Kuralt was burned out from what he called covering the world's chaos. He pitched CBS executives a radical idea: let him wander America without specific assignments, simply finding stories in forgotten corners of the country. To everyone's surprise, the network agreed. What emerged from that gamble became On the Road. one of television journalism's most influential and beloved projects, and the platform that would transform Kuralt from respected correspondent into national icon. The on-the-road concept was deceptively simple. Kuralt and a small crew would travel in a motorhome, stocked with peanut butter sandwiches and beer, choosing destinations almost randomly. They avoided interstates in favor of two-lane highways, preferring small towns where life moved at a different pace. There were no breaking news events to cover, no politicians to interview, no scandals to investigate. Instead, Kuralt would simply talk to people, farmers, artists, shopkeepers, retirees, and find the extraordinary within their ordinary lives. The storytelling struck gold immediately. He profiled a 99-year-old bricklayer still perfecting his craft, hands gnarled but precise. He visited a New Hampshire couple making maple syrup the same way their grandparents had, tapping trees in snow-covered forests with reverent patience. He found a Montana schoolteacher who taught in the same one-room schoolhouse for 5 decades, shaping generations of ranch children. Each segment ran just a few minutes, but within that brief window, Kuralt captured something essential about American character: resilience, ingenuity, quiet dignity. Time magazine called these segments 2-minute ceasefires in an era defined by Vietnam protests, urban riots, and political assassinations. While other news programs showed America tearing itself apart, Kuralt revealed the glue holding communities together. He found the Korean War veteran running a small-town diner where everyone knew each other's names. He documented folk artists preserving dying crafts, woodcarvers, quilt makers, blacksmiths, who represented continuity in a rapidly changing world. His stories were apolitical, yet deeply humanistic, showing a divided nation its own fundamental decency. His approach became legendary for what it rejected. Kuralt deliberately avoided sensationalism, never narrating with artificial urgency or manufactured drama. His scripts were literary, even poetic, but never pretentious. He let subjects speak for themselves, using silence as effectively as words. This restraint felt revolutionary in broadcast journalism, where brevity often meant superficiality. Kuralt proved that television could offer depth, reflection, and genuine insight if given space to breathe. His commitment to backroads over highways wasn't just logistical, it symbolized a philosophical rebellion against the speed and superficiality dominating modern media. In 1979, CBS launched Sunday Morning with Kuralt as founding host, creating a program unlike anything else on television news. The show blended serious reporting with reflective segments on nature, art, music, and the rhythms of American life. It opened not with urgent headlines, but with 90 seconds of unnarrated nature footage, a radical choice that signaled the show's contemplative philosophy. Kuralt's presence gave the program its identity: thoughtful, unhurried, trustworthy. He approached hosting with the same obsessive attention to detail that defined his road reporting. Colleagues remembered him demanding countless retakes, rewriting scripts until every word felt precisely right, agonizing over pacing and tone. This perfectionism wasn't vanity. It reflected genuine craft. Kuralt understood television's power to shape perception and refused to squander that responsibility on careless work. Sunday mornings became appointment viewing for millions who craved substance over spectacle, depth over sensationalism. The accolades accumulated impressively. He collected multiple Peabody Awards and Emmy Awards, honors recognizing both his individual excellence and his program's cultural impact. His 1990 memoir, A Life on the Road, became an immediate bestseller, with readers hungry for insights from the man they'd invited into their homes for decades. Critics and colleagues called him the voice of America's conscience, a journalist whose integrity seemed absolutely unimpeachable. By the mid-1990s, Kuralt's reputation had transcended journalism. He represented something larger, a connection to simpler values, to honesty and authenticity in an increasingly cynical age. Parents told their children to watch Kuralt's segments to understand what good reporting looked like. Journalism schools played his work as masterclasses in storytelling. His public image as America's gentle truth teller appeared utterly unassailable, which made what came next, the revelation of his secret life, all the more devastating. The double life began in 1968 when Kuralt met Patricia Shannon in Reno, Nevada. She was a divorced mother of 3, intelligent and independent, working to support her children. Kuralt, already married to Susanna P.D. Baird for over a decade, was immediately smitten. He showed up at Shannon's door with roses and conversation that stretched through the night. What began as attraction quickly deepened into something more complex, a relationship he would maintain for 29 years while continuing his marriage. Kuralt didn't just conduct an affair, he built an entire parallel existence. He supported Shannon and her children financially, paying for college tuitions, medical expenses, and daily living costs. He called her every night when traveling, wrote letters signed Pop, and spent holidays with her family. To Shannon's children, he became a surrogate father, present for graduations, offering advice, celebrating milestones. This wasn't a casual indiscretion, but a sustained, deliberate construction of a second family. The Montana property became the physical embodiment of this duplicity. In 1985, Kuralt purchased 20 acres along the Big Hole River, eventually expanding to 90 acres with a cabin. To his wife Petey, he described it as just a fishing spot, a place to escape and recharge between assignments. In reality, it was a retreat he shared primarily with Shannon, where they could live openly without fear of discovery. He'd invite her for extended stays, cooking meals together, walking the property, playing at a domestic life he couldn't acknowledge publicly. The deception required meticulous compartmentalization. In New York, Petey managed their social calendar, hosting dinner parties and maintaining relationships with Kuralt's CBS colleagues. She believed in the marriage, trusted her husband completely, never suspected the scope of his double life. Meanwhile, in Montana, Kuralt was Pop, fixing breakfast, discussing Shannon's work, planning future improvements to the property. He moved between these worlds seamlessly, maintaining the facade for nearly 3 decades without either woman discovering the truth. The emotional calculus required for such sustained deception is difficult to fathom, but Kuralt managed it until his final days. By early 1997, Kuralt's health had deteriorated significantly. Lupus, the autoimmune disease he'd battled for years, was winning. In June, he was hospitalized in New York, weak and in considerable pain. Doctors offered little hope for significant recovery. Facing mortality, Kuralt's thoughts turned to Shannon and the Montana property. He wanted to ensure she'd inherit what he'd always promised her. On June 18, 1997, just 16 days before his death, Kuralt wrote a letter to Shannon from his hospital bed. The handwriting was shaky, but the intention crystal clear. "I'll have the lawyer visit the hospital to be sure you inherit the rest of the place in Montana if it comes to that." The phrasing was careful, almost legalistic, but the meaning unmistakable. He was attempting to transfer ownership posthumously, securing Shannon's future even as his own life slipped away. The letter represented both a final act of love and a catastrophic failure of foresight. Kuralt had decades to formalize his wishes through proper legal channels, to update his will, establish trusts, or simply be honest with his family about Shannon's existence. Instead, he procrastinated until the very end, perhaps hoping he'd never have to confront the consequences of his double life. The scrawled hospital note became evidence of his intentions, but also proof of his cowardice. He wanted to provide for Shannon without ever having to explain her to anyone who mattered. What's striking is that even in his final days, surrounded by his legal wife and daughters, Kuralt continued the deception. He never confessed to Petey, never prepared his children for what would emerge after his death. He simply wrote the letter, mailed it to Montana, and apparently hoped everything would work itself out. This wasn't noble sacrifice or tragic romance. It was the final chapter of sustained dishonesty from a man who'd become so practiced at compartmentalization that he couldn't break the pattern even as death approached. He never completed the formal legal transfer. Charles Kuralt died on July 4, 1997, with his wife and daughters at his bedside. The funeral service attracted journalism's elite, colleagues, admirers, network executives, all gathering to celebrate America's beloved storyteller. Then Patricia Shannon walked through the door. She carried the hospital letter and 29 years of correspondence, poems, and photographs documenting their relationship. In that moment, at his funeral, Kuralt's double life was exposed to his family. His daughters watched their mother's face as the truth materialized before them. Their father hadn't been the man they thought they knew. The timing of Shannon's arrival felt almost theatrical, though it likely wasn't planned that way. She came to mourn the man she'd loved for 3 decades, carrying documents that proved their relationship in case anyone questioned her right to be there. She probably didn't intend to shatter his family's grief, but the effect was devastating nonetheless. Imagine Petey Kuralt, mourning her husband of nearly 50 years, suddenly confronting evidence that half their marriage had been a lie. Imagine his daughters realizing their father had an entire second family they'd never known about. The funeral became not just a goodbye, but a revelation. The moment Charles Kuralt's carefully constructed public image collided catastrophically with the private truth he'd spent decades hiding. The Montana property, appraised at over $600,000, became the center of an immediate legal battle. Kuralt's widow and 2 daughters contested Shannon's claim, arguing that the hospital letter didn't constitute a valid will modification. They portrayed Shannon as an opportunist exploiting a dying man's confusion. The legal arguments were technical, questions of testamentary intent, proper witnessing, and whether a handwritten note could override existing estate documents. But beneath the legalese was raw betrayal and competing grief. Shannon's legal team presented overwhelming evidence of Kuralt's intentions. They submitted the June 18th letter as proof of his final wishes. They produced decades of correspondence, love letters, poems, birthday cards, all documenting the relationship's depth and duration. They showed canceled checks proving continuous financial support, property documents with both names, and testimony from Shannon's children about Kuralt's role in their lives. The paper trail was extensive and damning. Particularly compelling were earlier documents showing Kuralt had already deeded 20 acres of the Montana property to Shannon in 1990. The remaining 70 acres were what the hospital letter referenced. The rest of the place. This established a pattern of intent spanning years, not a deathbed whim. Shannon's attorneys argued persuasively that Kuralt had been systematically transferring property to her, and the final letter simply continued that established plan. The evidence painted a picture of a man who'd made clear, repeated promises to provide for his second family. Kuralt's widow and daughters found themselves in an impossible position. Defending the estate meant publicly arguing that their husband and father had been deceived or manipulated, an admission that contradicted everything they thought they knew about his character. Alternatively, they could acknowledge the relationship's authenticity, which meant accepting decades of deliberate betrayal. Either way, they lost. The legal battle forced them to dissect Charles Kuralt's life in open court, transforming private devastation into public spectacle. In September 2000, the Montana Supreme Court ruled in Shannon's favor. The justices determined that Kuralt's letter, while informal, constituted a valid modification of his estate plans under Montana law. The state had specific provisions recognizing handwritten, unwitnessed documents as legally binding if they clearly expressed testamentary intent, and Kuralt's letter met that standard. The Big Hole River property transferred to Shannon. However, the victory was Pyrrhic. Legal fees consumed much of the estate's value. Tax obligations gutted what remained. Kuralt's family received far less than expected, while Shannon gained property shadowed by scandal. Nobody truly won. The court's decision was legally sound but emotionally unsatisfying. It resolved property ownership but couldn't address the deeper questions. What were Kuralt's true feelings toward either woman? Did he love both, or was he simply too cowardly to choose? Could someone who deceived so thoroughly for so long truly love anyone? The ruling gave Shannon legal vindication but couldn't restore the reputation of the man she'd loved. It gave Kuralt's legal family closure on the property dispute, but not on their shattered understanding of who he'd been. The public revelation devastated Kuralt's carefully constructed legacy. The man who'd spent decades celebrating honesty and authenticity had lived a profound lie. His betrayal wasn't momentary weakness, but sustained deception spanning nearly 3 decades. The contradiction between his public integrity and private duplicity felt especially sharp given his profession. How could journalism's truth teller have been so thoroughly dishonest in his own life? The scandal forced a reckoning with how we construct and believe in public personas, and what happens when those carefully maintained facades finally collapse under the weight of revealed truth. In 2002, Patricia Shannon published Charles and Me, a Love Story, offering her perspective on their 29-year relationship. The memoir described romantic trips to Ireland, intimate late-night phone calls, and Kuralt's evolution from famous journalist to devoted partner. Shannon portrayed him as a man trapped by circumstances, genuinely loving 2 women, unable to choose between them, ultimately failing both. The book presented their relationship not as sordid affair, but as genuine love story constrained by impossible circumstances. Shannon's narrative attempted to humanize Kuralt's choices, suggesting he was paralyzed by competing loyalties rather than simple moral failure. She described a man who desperately wanted to leave his marriage but couldn't bear the thought of publicly disappointing millions who saw him as embodying traditional values. In Shannon's telling, Kuralt was victim of his own success. His public image had become a prison from which he saw no escape. The book painted him as tragically flawed rather than deliberately cruel, a man who loved deeply but lacked the courage to live honestly. Critics and readers remained divided. Some found Shannon's account self-serving, an attempt to romanticize what was ultimately sustained betrayal of multiple people. Others saw it as a necessary corrective to narratives that painted Shannon purely as homewrecker. The truth likely resided somewhere between. Kuralt was neither noble romantic hero nor calculating villain, but rather a deeply flawed man who made choices that devastated everyone involved. Shannon's memoir complicated the story without resolving its fundamental moral ambiguities. For Kuralt's daughters, the book compounded their pain. They'd already lost their father. Now they had to process the public exposure of his betrayal through Shannon's sympathetic lens. What they'd inherited wasn't just diminished wealth, but a fractured legacy. Every On the Road segment, every Sunday morning episode, every celebration of Kuralt's integrity now carried the weight of knowing what he'd hidden. They couldn't separate the journalist from the man, the public truth teller from the private deceiver. The daughters' public silence spoke volumes. They never published competing memoirs or gave detailed interviews about their father's double life. Their restraint contrasted sharply with Shannon's decision to tell her story publicly. Perhaps they simply wanted privacy after having their family trauma exposed in court and media. Or perhaps they recognized that no public statement could reconcile the father they'd known with the man revealed by Shannon's evidence. Their silence became its own form of testimony about the impossibility of making sense of Kuralt's contradictions. Public perception shifted dramatically and permanently. Fans who'd considered Kuralt America's honest storyteller now grappled with feelings of betrayal. Some defended him, arguing private failures shouldn't diminish professional achievements. Others felt his hypocrisy, celebrating authenticity while living a lie, made his work ring hollow. The debate revealed uncomfortable truths about how we construct icons, investing public figures with moral authority they may not deserve. Kuralt's fall reminded audiences that admiring someone's work doesn't mean truly knowing their character. The journalism community particularly struggled with Kuralt's legacy. His on-the-road segments remained objectively excellent television. The storytelling craft, the empathetic interviewing, the poetic narration all still worked as powerfully as ever. But schools and retrospectives now had to contextualize his work within his biography. How do you teach Kuralt's journalism without addressing the man behind it? Can we separate artistic achievement from personal conduct? These questions had no satisfying answers, leaving Kuralt's professional legacy perpetually shadowed by his personal failures. Charles Kuralt's legacy remains deeply paradoxical. His journalistic contributions are undeniable. He pioneered a storytelling approach that influenced generations of broadcast journalists. He showed that television could offer depth and humanity rather than just headlines and soundbites. His on-the-road segments are still taught in journalism schools as examples of masterful narrative craft. He gave voice to ordinary Americans and revealed the dignity in everyday lives. Yet he gave America honesty on screen while living dishonesty at home. The gap between his public integrity and private deception colors everything he created. It's impossible to watch his segments celebrating authentic living without thinking about the life he was hiding. His story isn't just about one man's failures. It's about the dangerous distance between public image and private truth, and how even our most trusted figures can carry devastating secrets. Perhaps the broader lesson extends beyond Kuralt himself. His double life illuminates how we construct and maintain public personas, and how thoroughly those constructed identities can diverge from lived reality. In an era before social media, before constant surveillance, Kuralt could compartmentalize with remarkable efficiency. He exploited the privacy his fame actually afforded. Nobody questioned where America's gentle storyteller spent his time off camera. The final image of Charles Kuralt should perhaps be his motorhome winding down another back road, searching for stories of ordinary Americans living authentic lives. Inside that vehicle was a man whose own most extraordinary story, the elaborate double life, the secret family, the decades of deception, remained hidden even as he celebrated others' truths. He found America's heart while concealing his own. That contradiction, uncomfortable as it is, may be his most enduring legacy, a reminder that we truly never know the full story of anyone's life. Even those we invite into our homes and trust with our attention, even icons carry shadows.